Welcome to Precision Signals, a new podcast from the CEO Roundtable on cancer. I'm Khozin. The series explores transformation in cancer research and care, not just in how we understand disease biology, but in how discoveries move through the bottlenecks of clinical trials, regulatory frameworks, reimbursement systems, and institutional behaviors that shape what ultimately reaches patient. From the lab bench to the treatment guideline, from policy to practice, we aim to follow the signal, however faint, beneath the noise. In this first episode, we turn to artificial intelligence. It's a rare topic that fills plenary halls, drives investor optimism, and still leaves many clinicians asking, where is the actual utility? Despite hundreds of regulatory clearances, very few AI tools have been evaluated in prospective, randomized clinical trials, and fewer still have demonstrated impact at the bedside. AI seems to be everywhere, except where most oncologists actually practice. To unpack this tension between technological promise and clinical reality, I'm joined by two extraordinary guests. Dr. Cora Sternberg is a medical oncologist and a global authority in GU cancers. She has led numerous practice-defining clinical trials across prostate, renal, and bladder cancers, and played a central role in advancing the field of targeted therapies and drug development in GU cancers. In addition to her scientific contributions, she also brings deep expertise in navigating the regulatory, institutional, and operational complexities of global cancer research. She currently serves as the clinical director of the Englander Institute for Precision Medicine at Weill Cornell. Dr. Olivier Elemento is the director of the Englander Institute for Precision Medicine and a leader in computational biology and precision medicine. His research integrates genomics, artificial intelligence, and real-world clinical data to support drug discovery and data-driven decision-making in cancer care. With academic appointments spanning physiology, biophysics, and computational biomedicine, his work focuses on developing models that not only predict clinical outcomes, but also interrogate the assumptions embedded in how we generate and interpret biomedical knowledge. My conversation with Drs. Elemento and Sternberg reinforced a critical point. For AI to become standard practice in oncology, success won't necessarily rest on the shoulders of a single algorithm or headline-grabbing metric. Rather, it will depend on building robust, interoperable systems, spanning data infrastructure, clinical integration, and institutional oversight that can adapt to emerging evidence, enable continuous validation, and ensure transparency. In this domain, trust is not bestowed by novelty, but earned through rigorous architecture and accountable design. Let's step into the conversation and trace the signal beneath the noise. Cora, hi, Olivier. Thank you for joining us today.
So it's great to be here.
Excellent. So before we delve into the future of AI in oncology, which is the theme of our discussion today, I'd like to step back a little bit and learn a little more about yourselves, how you got into doing what you do today, and where your interest in AI came from. Olivier, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I've been doing AI for a very long time. I started doing AI back in the days where AI was not at all the way it is now. It was basically during the AI winter where, AI had clear limitations and, had a lot of potential, but also limitations. I persevered and continued to try to use and apply AI to all kinds of problems, from biomedical research to clinical AI problems. Eventually doing what I'm doing now, which is I'm the director of the Institute at Weill Cornell Medicine that's focused on precision medicine, where we use genomics and AI to try to make medicine more personalized for cancer patients, but also for all kinds of other patients. And I'm amazed about how AI has changed because, it was... Now it's a game-changing technology that's affecting everything we do. The potential is amazing, and I'm very eager to be here today to discuss, how we can use AI more in oncology moving forward. I'm excited about the field. I'm excited about what AI can contribute, and look forward to a discussion.
Thank you, Olivier. I remember back in the day before the advent of LLMs, we should talk a lot about AI, and I used to read a lot of your papers. Especially looking forward to dissect out the themes that we've been talking about essentially for years. Cora, it would be great to see how you view the ecosystem through the lens of a physician. And I recently found out that you spent a number of years in Italy, which is quite interesting. Obviously, Italy has a completely different healthcare system than the United States. So it would be great to learn a little more about you and how you have been approaching AI, what you think about AI, and also about your journey into clinical medicine and now the intersection of AI and biomedicine.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here and be part of the Englander Institute of Precision Medicine and to know you as well, Sean. I'm a medical oncologist. I became a medical oncologist after I worked at Stanford University, where I met for the first time women medical oncologists who really impressed me in a positive way. At the time, very few people were going into oncology. When I would go to an ASCO meeting, there were 5,000 people. There are now 40,000. And at the time, it was difficult for a woman to become a cardiologist or a surgeon. And I thought oncology is something special. I can really do something to help people. Then I did my training at Sloan Kettering, and I was on staff there when I went to lecture about a chemotherapy that I developed, a regimen at Sloan Kettering. I went to Italy to lecture for the first time and fell in love the last day of the meeting with an Italian urologist whom I ultimately married. And I lived in Italy for over 30 years. We're still married. And I was chief of medical oncology for 16 years in a large hospital in Rome and developed a sort of a mini Sloan Kettering there. But the allure of knowing bioinformatic people like Olivier Elemento and coming back to precision medicine and genomics and genetics was too much for me to stay in Italy. So I came back here about 6.5 years ago, and I'm professor of medicine at Weill Cornell and clinical director at the Englander Institute of Precision Medicine. My specialty is in genitourinary oncology. That's the work I've done primarily. But being with bioinformatic people, looking where genomics and genetics was going, learning about AI, I couldn't stay in Italy anymore. I had to go and I had to see what was this transformative new medicine that was happening, molecular biology, molecular markers. It was hard to do that in a socialized system, which has many advantages that we could talk about later. But some of the things that I thought I was missing, I've learned a lot here being here. And AI is definitely transformative. I feel about AI the way I felt when I first saw Google. I mean, I was just so excited. This is something new. I can find out all these things. And that's the same with AI. But we have to understand its limitations as well.
Absolutely. And recently, we wrote an article together on AI in the New England Journal of Medicine. And we made several observations in our article, including the fact that despite all the technical progress, clinical adoption in AI has been lagging behind. Now, obviously, there are multiple reasons for that, but what do you think are the primary reasons behind the slow adoption of AI tools in clinical decision-making and also in drug discovery and drug development? You know, we've been talking about AI in these domains for several years. So what do you think are the major barriers to adoption and impact? Olivier, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I can start. I think, like you said, there's multiple different obstacles to broad adoption. I think the one that we highlighted in the review, and I think is really critical, is really the lack of clinical evidence, real world clinical evidence supporting the use of these AI models to improve outcomes or do something tangible for patients and physicians, and ideally both. I think we're talking about AI. There's a lot of companies in this space. Feel like there's been a bit of a reluctance for many of these companies to invest in the generation of clinical evidence. In my view, in the form of randomized clinical trials. That's the gold standard way to generate clinical evidence. That is something that Cora has been doing in an amazing way for. And I really feel that's what the field needs now is essentially testing of these tools in a clinical setting. I think one of the big points that we made in the review was the fact that there's a perception of AI mostly as a kind of diagnostic sort of type of tool. But I feel that we need to change that perception and move towards essentially AI providing recommendations for treatment selection, which essentially, is not quite unlike in some ways, in terms of clinical evidence, what is required for therapeutic trials, where you understand how these models perform in the real world, what kind of outcomes they provide, how much they extend lives of patients or improve over what types of outcomes, quality of life, and so on. We need to understand how these models are really impacting patients in the real world.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. It's very interesting, Olivier, that the FDA has cleared hundreds of AI applications, primarily through the 510K pathway, which is based on a predicate. It seems like that stamp of approval, if you will, is not sufficient for clinical adoption and certainly not adequate for reimbursement. So Olivier, given the fact that the stakes are so high, companies spend a lot of money and resources developing these models, and then they fall short when it comes to adoption and monetization. So why do you think we're not conducting randomized clinical trials with AI-based solutions?
Well, I think that the big elephant in the room is that a lot of companies feel that they don't really need to conduct those trials, that they essentially can mimic a little bit the way that AI goes in kind of, consumer AI, where AI tools are directly deployed to consumers without, essentially clinical trials. But I think medicine is quite different. And medicine has, obviously a lot of risk in terms of, patients, a lot of aspects of medicine really require this kind of evidence, which is not required for consumer AI sort of products. Personally speaking, I feel like, I've heard that many times from multiple different startups. Venture capital companies tend to not like so much to see the money used for funding clinical trials. Because again, in consumer AI, you don't need to do that. And so I think that mindset of not believing that the evidence generation is important is really, really, I think, there. And I think that needs to change. I think that companies need to embrace the fact that to deploy them in the AI for patients, they need to create the evidence that's required to support the deployment. So I think that really needs to change.
Yeah. It's unfortunate because in a lot of cases, I suppose that in the lack of appropriate clinical evidence supporting the use of an AI tool, these companies can really face major hurdles and ultimately could be existential. So perhaps it's to everyone's benefit, including the investors, to think about AI-based companies that are developing solutions in biomedicine more as device or drug development ventures, where you need to have several years of pre-revenue R&D, followed by formal evidence generation, typically using randomized clinical trials. Hopefully, we're moving in the right direction because the evidence base needed to convince Cora, someone like you who sees patients, and you have to make very critical decisions based on the totality of the evidence that you're looking at for individual patients. So given that the risks could be quite high if a model, for example, is biased or not appropriately validated, what would it take for someone like you, physician, to be convinced that the AI model's recommendations are trustworthy? And what kind of evidence would you need to be confident in an AI solution?
As physicians, Sean, we took a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. And I think that we need to think about that. I think when patients they're getting their medical data even before they speak to the doctor sometimes, it just spit out to them and they immediately go on the computer and they look it up. And the main things they're looking at are side effects and what are the opportunities for their next treatment or clinical trials or whatever they can look at. Some of that might be okay, but for me at least, I would like to know that the trials were done properly and validated properly, that the AI was using either good guidelines and medical research and good source data. And I want to know what is their source data, that they didn't make up the literature, because we've seen that happen as well, that sometimes they'll make up references. And that's the thing that scares physicians who know a little bit about AI, but I don't know how many people know these things that are called hallucinations. I was fighting with a chat box for 5 days when I was preparing a lecture the other day because they kept showing me as a blonde. And I kept doing other things that were really weird. And that was just a not important thing. But if it was for a patient, or I was a patient, or I was a physician in a rural area who was only looking up things in that way, I think it could be dangerous. And I think that more people need to understand the kind of things that you understand, and that we're beginning to all understand, is that we need validation. The problem with randomized clinical trials, as we've done them with drugs, let's say, and many of the devices, is they take years. And sometimes by the time they're finished, they're very expensive. And by the time they're finished, they're outdated already, especially with the drugs and probably the devices as well. So that's a kind of a drawback for some of it, but I don't have the best solution for how the randomized trials should be done. If they should be looking at large databases as well as to validate their their hypotheses, because there's certainly, I personally would not just trust a chat box at the moment in terms of medical things. I think that, many patients don't really realize that, and they'll go right on the chat box and read the first thing that comes out. So I think that there's no way, it's for me, when I see a patient in person, it's completely different than when I see a person even on Zoom. And today with Zoom, we have more and more meetings, but we don't know each other. So I think that it's the same thing. If you feel and touch a patient, it's different than on Zoom. And if you just listen to chat box and you don't talk to your doctor as well to filter what you've read, I think it's a problem. So I think we really need to, as you say, validate what we're doing, what the AI devices are doing, if you want the physicians to really use them better.
Yeah, I think the doctor-patient therapeutic bond is quite critical, and we don't want certainly AI to erode that, just like how, unfortunately, electronic health records eroded the patient-physician therapeutic relationship because physicians started to spend so much time on data entry and clicking boxes. So perhaps AI can automate the mechanics of the enterprise so that we can focus all of our attention on treating patients and reestablishing that therapeutic bond. So Cora, you mentioned a lot of interesting data points, including the fact that clinical trials are expensive and they take a long time. Now, the problems with clinical trials are relatively well characterized. Unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of pragmatic solutions in terms of how to revitalize and modernize clinical trials. And it's quite interesting that this has been a major barrier for us in developing drugs and in therapeutic development in general. But now it's also a major barrier to validating AI tools. So something that now a new cohort of innovators, i.e. technologists, should now worry about. So what are some of the things that we can do? What are some practical solutions, Olivier?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, of course, that the trials that are required to validate the use of medical AI tools obviously are not traditional therapeutic trials where you test a new drug, and obviously you have to do a gigantic amount of monitoring to assess safety and so on. So we're talking more about pragmatic trials that typically can be done in the context of routine care, just still need to be optimized to become cost effective. As you mentioned, I think it's pretty crazy that now some countries have become so much more cost effective when it comes to conducting clinical trials. The entire field of drug discovery now is very focused on molecules in China, just because, among other things, the Chinese ecosystem is making clinical trials so much more cost effective compared to conducting trials here in the US. And so I think that needs to change. I do think that there is a way to plug AI throughout the entire clinical trial sort of infrastructure. I think one of the big things, for example, is to match clinical trials to patients. I think in many hospitals, likely will be including ours, there's a lot of patients, there's a lot of trials, but there's still a disconnect between the patients and the trials, and not all patients get exposed to potentially trials that they could potentially down the line benefit from, or could help the field. And so I think that's just an example of this automatic matching. In my view, it's actually a very low hanging fruit that should happen in every hospital. Every hospital should have internally a tool to use AI to match patients to trials. Keyword generative AI and LLMs, can be outstanding at, right? Because we actually can manage the textual, sort of mapping, the fuzziness, some of the text in some cases, they can manage really well. I think throughout the infrastructure, I think there's just so many ways to use AI to optimize trials. And so I'm really excited about that as well. And we're working on some of these aspects, here at Cornell. But I think this is really something that should essentially take a lot of attention from a lot of the players. And like you said, I think I'm excited to, see moving forward that maybe more actors are going to lobby for the trials here conducted in the US to be more effective and more cost effective, because there's room to improve. And I'm hoping that venture capital, for example, will at some point lobby that for our trials to be done in a faster and cheaper way.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating that a clinical trial, especially late phase studies, are essentially an exercise in data collection, and the way we're collecting the data is just so convoluted and not optimized by any means. So there's certainly a lot of room for improvement, both in terms of how we collect the data. You may also argue that where we collect the data, because, for example, in oncology, 5% of patients with cancer have access to cancer clinical trials because they tend to be geographically localized and isolated to certain regions and centers of excellence, as we call them. So the clinical trials is a major problem both in drug development, and unfortunately now the same problems are a major barrier to AI clinical validation and adoption. So speaking, since we're on that theme, do we think appropriate clinical validation in a prospective clinical study is more important than explainability of the model? So Olivier, we'll start with you.
Well, I think explainability is important. I think it's, in my view, it's a bit overblown to some extent. I think the bottom line is that, I'm not a physician, Cora, and you guys, are both physicians, but we kind of fused all together to think about some aspect of the human body, for example, as, a black box. Not everything can be explained. That hasn't prevented medicine from, improving massively in the past, sort of many, sort of decades, especially in the past, few decades. So, I think that as long as there is clinical evidence that an AI model, for example, is bringing tangible benefit to patients, I think explainability obviously is important and is, a big plus. But if there is real tangible benefit, I think that is the most important aspect of the process. I think as the field moves forward and as we understand more about, both the biology and signals that AI is trying to capture to kind of make, a particular recommendation, for example, as well as, what's happening within AI models, which, obviously are very complicated because, in modern AI models, like, the GPTs of this world have billions and billions of parameters. At some point, probably going to have trillions of them. So obviously understanding specifically what every single neuron is doing is going to be very challenging. It's going to take a long time. But again, I think, the field is trying to achieve that understanding. But in the meantime, I think if we can generate clinical evidence that an AI model is really providing tangible benefits, you got to say that by itself would be a major driver for adoption of medical AI.
Yeah, what we call controlled empiricism, dating back to, I guess, the scurvy trials of a couple hundred years ago. So, Cora, what about you? How do you view explainability versus clinical validation? That is, do you really need to know how and why the AI solution is making its recommendations or predictions? Is the ability to explain how the AI is thinking important to you? Or do you think that if the tool has been validated prospectively in a randomized study, it doesn't necessarily have to be explainable?
Well, if it were to be in oncology tested in a randomized clinical trial, that by using such and such AI is better than just empirically guessing what to do next for a patient, that would be good. But I don't know of those randomized clinical trials. I wish they were available. But since they're not, when I use an AI tool or when I look at these AI tools, I want to understand, how did they come up with this? Did they make it up? Are they hallucinating? Are they just agreeing with what I say? How? And, we know for the future, in terms of clinical trials, that the AI has come a long way in looking at the electronic health records and needs to come further. But mining data from the electronic health records, mining data of molecular pathology that we have, looking at the patients and say, this patient could be in a clinical trial, but no, they have the wrong biopsy for the metastases. This patient's creatinine isn't right. Before coming out and spitting out things that make no sense. So I think we have a way to go in terms of, we don't have the validation. So at the moment, I want explainability. But that's just my own opinion.
It makes perfect sense. In a world where the clinical evidence for the performance of AI tools doesn't exist, then they would have to be, I suppose, explainable so that we can trust them, which means that we are limiting ourselves in terms of what types of models we can develop if they only want to be trusted or to be explainable. Another reason that we should all advocate for more seamless clinical trials, because again, clinical validation, it seems like, is the ultimate goal. One of the things you mentioned stood out. You mentioned what data sources the model is using for training. What are the inputs going into the model? And right now we're seeing a variety of different data sources, some noisy, some relatively clean, but in general, very heterogeneous. What are the best inputs? Is it clinical judgment? Is it publications, FDA labeled documents, post-approval decisions, or is it guideline recommendations that essentially codify how we deliver care in many cases?
I think what you mentioned, they're all very, very important. I think we can't just use only clinical guidelines because they're different from society to society. And some are more encompassing depending upon the insurers, and others are more restricted depending upon if it's a socialized medical system, for example. And so we have to understand what kind of guidelines are being used. And I think more than one kind of guideline should be used, but more than one recognized society, as well as competent literature review, as well as things published by the NIH, as well as many things. And I did a study of the AI when it was picking up from just the abstracts, which many people just read on PubMed, and then not necessarily reflected what was in the paper. I mean, there's more in the paper than just the abstract. So we have to understand, are they just using the abstract? Are they reviewing the whole paper? How were the guidelines developed? Were they voted on by people who are not experts, or was it only experts who developed the guidelines? I mean, there's many ways of looking at what went into it before you hire somebody, or you want to know what's the background. Where did they come from? What did they study? What did they do? It's the same sort of questions, I think, in kind of a simplified way.
That's a very important point. So the context of the training data used is quite important. For example, a lot of companies put guideline recommendations as the ultimate truth, in many cases as essentially the gold standard. And you're implying that may not always be the case because the context around the development of these guidelines is important to consider. In some cases, I suppose the guidelines reflect not just clinical realities, but reimbursement requirements and nuances that have to be taken into consideration. So for an AI model to be trained on those data sets can introduce essentially biases that may not be clinically relevant. And so, Olivier, what do you think should be the source of the truth if we can't always, I guess, rely on guidelines or clinical intuition or even our standard classification schemas? So what can be true? What's the best source of the truth?
Yeah, I think there really needs to be a concerted effort to create data sets that can be used, for benchmarking these AI models. I'm really convinced that in general, I think, for AI, especially medical AI, scientific AI, we kind of need to move from the world where, data is primarily consumed by people towards a world where data is going to be consumed a lot by AI, by machines, essentially. And so we need to think about benchmarks, data sets that will be used moving forward as the gold standard for developing AI models. I think that, for example, there's a gigantic amount of real-world data coming from different hospitals that in theory should be mined and should be made available, should be potentially even combined to create data sets that are very diverse, that can essentially kind of support the training of these AI models to essentially kind of mimic the kind of decision making that's happening in large hospitals, including diverse hospitals, not just in major cities but also in areas, for example. So I think that's really important to think about. These new data sets that are going to be used for training AI models. I mean, there's a lot of new modalities, nowadays that I think can be used. There's a lot of interest in organoids, for example, where, talking about avatars of patients. It's not, not perfect by any means. Institutes, as Cora knows, is very invested in this kind of models. But, we think of them as patient avatars in some ways. They're not perfect, but they allow the testing of many therapeutic hypotheses, thousands of compounds, many combinations. And I think that's the kind of data that, it's very hard to generate directly from patients, because you can treat patients one treatment regimen at a time, but you can't treat a patient with 1,000 different drugs. Yeah. But I think that's the kind of data that in theory could really help train better AI models moving forward and help make some connections between, for example, the presence of specific mutations and response to specific combinations. I think that's, really important. So, I think there's a lot of reflection that's required, in my view, to create these benchmark data sets, not just, to test AI models. That's important. And we need to make sure that those data sets are, set aside and AI models don't have access to them. That's actually a major problem, right? A lot of the LLMs that are being trained now, they're basically being trained on all of the data that's available. So if you want to test someone on the independent data set, but there's no such thing. All the data already has gone into training them. So we need to think about that. And I think, real world data, for example, is a good example of data that's underused in my view for testing these AI models.
Yeah. It's quite interesting that, real world data has been a focal point in drug development in recent years. Unfortunately, many believe that it hasn't fulfilled its promise, but now it seems like using LLMs to curate the data, one can get very close to the physician's thinking, which is really what matters the most when you're looking at electronic health record data. ICD codes, CPT codes, nobody's reading those codes to treat patients. These are essentially billing jargon, for lack of a better phrase. But that clinical judgment that's embedded into the note somewhere in sometimes a very long note that's copied over. And it seems like LLMs are pretty good at understanding the context and extracting the knowledge. So hopefully we'll see a resurgence of real-world evidence that's much more accurate and less noisy. And also here, that health systems are doing ambient scribes. I don't know, Cora, if you've seen that, recording the conversation between the physician and the patient, and then using that to structure the note in the EHR with eventual physician approval. How do you think about that, Cora, in terms of the body of knowledge that we have embedded into electronic health records? Has that really helped clinical decision-making, or do we still have a long way to go? And can AI actually help make the data in our EHRs more accurate?
I think the future is that the data in our EHRs will be used by AI to make things more accurate. I really think that's the future. And I personally have published, when I was in Italy, we didn't have a drug would get approved and it would be in the United States and it would take 2 years to get approved in Italy, for example. So I had 2 different publications of 1,000 patients worldwide, one with 2 different tumors, one in immunotherapy, one with hormonal therapy for prostate cancer. And those patients, those were very important studies. And I've often believed in those studies because the patients often that are in clinical trials are highly selected patients, major academic centers, they're younger, they're, the people, it's just different patients than the ones that are in the real world. And having, I think, access to real world patients, as Olivier mentioned, to help boost what they do in the data set is important. And being able to mine what's in the electronic health record will also be important in the future. I have not personally used them yet, but I know of my colleagues or esteemed colleagues who are using it. And I just need the time to sit down and try and use it instead of sitting there typing all the time. Because I know that when they use it, it helps them. Then they have to go and read it and correct it. For sure, it's not perfect yet, but I think that it will be the future, those kind of records. And maybe if they're more structured or something, the way we write them in the future, that might be more helpful. If we're more structured, the way we put in the side effects, which patients are so interested in, obviously, would be better. I think it could help a lot. I think, all of these things are very, very important. I wish I was already using the AI for electronic health records. I haven't yet used it.
Cora, what do you think about an AI model that's been trained solely on ICD codes and CPT codes?
That's not really going to be enough, and also these AI models, they're often using old data, old research. They're not up to date. The research keeps changing and changing and changing. So you have to know about the AI models. When I first started using one of them, it was only up to 2022, and it was in 2024 when I was using it. So that they're getting better and better and better, but they have to be up to date now because the fields is changing now in terms of everything, the models and the drugs and the devices. It's all changing, and I think we have to be up to date. And a model just using codes. I mean, I never use those codes for anything.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important for folks that are not clinicians and physicians to really understand that. ICD codes and CPT codes are essentially billing codes, and they're not really used in clinical decision making. And I see a lot of companies training their models based on these codes with the assumption that they truly reflect what's going on with the patient. So it seems like we need to be very cautious about those data sources. And again, it seems like the gist of the knowledge is embedded into the clinical notes that are unstructured. And again, hopefully AI will help us structure that content to feed back into the AI algorithms, which, Olivier, you mentioned something about the fact that the current training schemas obviously are not perfect. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here a little bit. It seems like the current diagnostic criteria and what we think of gold standards are also quite imperfect. For example, in my specialty, thoracic oncology, the way we classify lung cancer is by primarily the size of the cells. Histologically, we have small cell, and then we realize that there's another category where the cells aren't necessarily large. There are varying sizes. So we made up a phrase, non-small cell, which really is not anchored to any mechanistic reality. It's just a linguistic phrase that miraculously was codified in the 1960s by the WHO as a histopathological category. Not to say that visual phenotype is not important. It's somewhat predictive, but it has a very low predictive value. For example, if you give standard chemotherapy to a patient with non-small cell lung cancer, there's about a 30% response rate. The way I think about that is that, well, we got it wrong in the 70% of the cases. Because so a model perhaps trained on that histological classification will be no better. So what do we then, you mentioned data from electronic health records and other sources. How about, is it possible to really start focusing on the mechanism of disease as the source of the truth, the ultimate source of the truth? If so, how do we do that, Olivier?
Well, I think you've pointed exactly it. Essentially, what we're trying to achieve here at the Institute for Precision Medicine, our belief is that we need to understand the disease within every patient in a tremendous amount of detail, go way beyond what's being done now, which is very superficial in lots of different ways. So thankfully, I think the technologies exist, right? We can sequence somebody's cancer genome now, in a very short amount of time and get, all the mutations that characterize somebody's cancer. I think we're approaching being able to do this at single cell resolution. So, it's not even just one cancer genome. We can probably get, thousands of cancer genomes from each individual patients and understand how different cells have different mutations and, what that means in terms of the different subpopulations and how to treat those populations and not just treat one population. That's just an example. I think we can also, for example, now take snapshots of tumors at single cell resolution, visualize almost, the different cells and shape and what genes they express, what proteins they have, how they interact with each other. Like, we can do all these things now. And so, I think now it's really a matter of deploying these technologies at scale, making them as cost effective as possible, and demonstrating that, this kind of approach has clinical value. I think, in the logical way, it has to have clinical value because, it is about understanding the disease. It is about understanding the complexity of disease within the patient. I think that the techniques exist. I think it's just a matter of deploying them at scale and doing, once again, the kind of clinical evidence generation that's required to demonstrate improvement in outcomes. But I think this is the future, and I think this is going to happen very soon.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, there are two schools of thoughts, it seems like, when it comes to these tools and technologies as they relate to treating patients, in diagnostics that we employ for prognostication or for treatment recommendation. Some believe that we have to have clinically validated biomarkers before we even test the patients, which can take a very, very long time. And unless these biomarkers are approved as part of the clinical development program, that is as a companion diagnostic assay, it's very hard to qualify biomarkers. And in fact, the FDA has been trying to encourage the ecosystem to do that for several years. And there are a handful of qualified biomarkers because it takes time, very expensive, and there are no entities that are tasked with validating these biomarkers. So the question here is that we have all these diagnostic tools that can be as granular as the spatial structure of each cell in a tumor and also the macro and micro environment. But we're not using them, hard to scale. We need clinical validation. So Cora, which group do you feel closer to? The folks that need clinical validation for every biomarker that's being tested? Or do you find that there's utility in profiling patients, even though some of those biomarkers today may not be validated for clinical decision-making?
As a medical oncologist, I believe in clinical validation. And there's some examples of some small studies which do clinically validate biomarkers. also using AI, but not large. There are no really large studies, but there's some small. And those companies are moving quite quickly. But as an idea, we have patients with oncologic problems. They have cancer and they've already been through the regular standard treatment. And if we can understand more about their genome, more about their RNA expression, and give a hypothesis of what might help treat those patients, I think that's very important. The hypothesis generating that we will come up with by doing more transcriptomes, more RNA-seq, more exome, more whole sequencing, all of this is what I love about the Anglo Institute of Precision Medicine, that we're actually doing all this. And I think it's important. I mean, we do a precision medicine meeting every month and talk about patients and what we've learned using all of these techniques. But I think that, we talk about individual patients and we come up with hypotheses that sometimes if you want to use even off-label drugs, sometimes it's useful. We helped some patients. I have clearly helped some patients by doing this kind of sequencing.
Do you routinely do molecular profiling on patients?
As part of the IPM, I routinely test patients that are rare diseases, patients who have difficult tumors, but specifically the rare tumors where there aren't even a lot of studies around for what to give to these patients. I think that's very interesting from a point of view of what can we do next. But I can't yet routinely say that I test everyone, everything. I can't. I don't think we have the money for that yet, or we don't have the wherewithal yet to do that. Would be nice, but I don't think that that's where we are yet. Maybe I think it's part of the future.
Yeah, makes sense. Obviously, going back to payers, I think in cases where clinician may feel like testing is appropriate, they have to take into consideration reimbursement realities. So it seems like it's all interconnected. And Olivier, in terms of, we talked about electronic health records as a useful source of truth for training AI models, especially as we get better in structuring the clinical notes where the majority of the information is. But do you think, since we're not doing a lot of sequencing at the point of care, deep sequencing, and it's not done in a systematic way, that there's only so deep that we can go with data in the electronic health record?
Yeah, I mean, that's a limitation for sure. Just going back for a minute to, the biomarkers, and, I have maybe a controversial view on this. I think that the FDA should mandate biomarkers actually for everything. Honestly, not having a biomarker when you develop a drug, essentially it's an admission that you don't understand what the drug does. If you understand what the drug does, can in all likelihood come up with a very simple test that, is quantifying the extent to which the patient has the mechanism that you want to target before targeting the patient. So I think this is connected to why, in my view, so many drugs fail in clinical trials. Don't understand what they do precisely, and often they fail, or they fail in a very large fraction of patients, which basically means that the trial is negative. So I think the FDA should absolutely, in my view, mandate biomarkers, in most trials, because I think it would actually make a gigantic difference. And it would force the ecosystem to adapt and to essentially become more efficient. It's not normal to have to wait 1 month, 2 months to get a sequencing result. I mean, it's not normal, and it even doesn't make any sense. I mean, technologically, we can do a lot better already. It's just that, we need to invest in infrastructure to achieve that efficiency. So, I think we'll get there eventually, but I think this is something, in my view, I think the regulators should, maybe pay attention to.
Well, hopefully as the cost of testing continues to decrease, it'll be more democratized. Certainly, the assays themselves are almost commoditized now. And the hardware and the analytes and the assays themselves are quite excessive, but there's still, I guess, a gap before they reach the patient.
Yeah, as an aside, I think I hear that a lot, but I'm not, particularly convinced. I mean, obviously they're expensive. Everything's expensive, especially medicine, right? But what's most expensive, as an aside, is actually the cost of the drugs, right? And that's actually, 10 times, 100 times, maybe 1,000 times more expensive than biomarker testing, right? As an aside. So I think the excuse that it's too expensive to test for biomarkers, I don't personally buy it. Don't see any evidence for that. I think it's just that, the system is not embraced this concept, as much as it should.
As an idea, I agree with everything Olivier said, but there have been some drugs, more than some, that have been approved because of the large randomized clinical trials, and they don't even know how they work. There is no biomarker because there is no biomarker. They haven't developed the biomarker. They've developed the drug and they've developed the trial. And we have approvals, major approvals for many drugs. And I wish it wasn't that way, but some things are that way, others are not that way. And I hope in the future, maybe AI will help us to have more hypotheses of what could be future biomarkers as well.
Sure.
But when you think about it, I mean, for example, what we see now in MSI-positive cancers with immunotherapy checkpoint inhibitor, I mean, that's the gold standard, right? I mean, it's essentially a patient population where there's almost like 100% response, right? And so that's essentially what every trial in theory should achieve, to at least attempt to achieve. You know, I think what's happening now is that coin toss, right? In some cases, the trial is positive. In some cases, it's not. Essentially, it's all about the level of statistical significance that the trial achieves, right? And it's based on p-values that often very modest. And the reason for this is that a very small subset of patients respond. Right? We just don't know what that subset is going to be at a time. But if there was more work upfront to actually come up with an understanding of what drugs do in patients, we'd be able to come up with biomarker and ensure that many more trials are successful.
I was just thinking of an example of this, that I went to a terrible ODAC meeting. I was working with I was the PI on a study in prostate cancer with an oral platinum drug. And the drug was a really good, interesting drug, but we knew nothing about homologous recombination deficiency at the time. We gave it to everybody. So that was not the way of selecting the patients. I know that now, many years later. And people are calling me, where is that drug? Where is that drug? Well, the company died. I don't find the drug anymore. Now we know about homologous recombination deficiency. Everybody wants that drug years later. I think things like that, the more we learn, the more we can improve on how we treat our patients and not have all these negative trials with wrong hypotheses to start with.
In terms of when we think about biomarkers, obviously, a lot of folks think about things that you can test in the tissue or the blood, but it seems like, especially with the rise of AI-based diagnostics, digital histopathology, for example, and other modalities, we can expand our definition of what a biomarker is. And there's this idea, for example, digital biomarkers that's surfacing. Now, Olivier, you've done some interesting work there. Remember that at some point you were working on a study that was developing a digital biomarker based on voice recognition. Can you tell us a little more about?
Yeah, it's a part of a funded study that is still ongoing, where we're attempting to create a data set. And essentially, it goes back to what we're discussing about creating data sets that are AI ready. But the goal is to create a data set of voices coming from different patients with different types of conditions, everything from, mental health conditions to issues regarding, the larynx and different aspects of the voice system, to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. I think there's pretty decent evidence that there are some changes that occur in patients as we develop particular conditions, such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, for example. And what we're trying to do in that study is to essentially collect enough data so that we can down the line develop biomarkers that would allow us to detect those conditions as early as possible. And I think the big appeal here is that a biomarker like voice, unlike having to sequence DNA from a piece of tissue, but it's not so easy to obtain. Voice is like probably one of the cheapest biomarker that I can think of in terms of at least in terms of acquisition. And so we're trying to establish this concept that we across many different types of disease, we can detect those diseases as early as possible using voice. The project is still in the early phase of data generation, but it's really exciting. I think I'm really excited about it because I think one is that it shows that, like you said, I think we can collect biomarkers, not just focused on molecular activity, but also other things that we can quantify from patients, including voice and other things like, the face, features and so on. But I think it's also an area where AI is critical, right? Because, it's not, we're talking about subtle signals. And I think, at least personally speaking, if I listen to some of those voices, I'm not going to be able to see differences between people with specific conditions and healthy individuals. But the AI tools appear to be quite good at doing that. Whether they'll be good enough to, give rise to clinically applicable biomarkers, I think the jury is still out. But I think it's a really exciting project that combines AI and novel biomarkers. I'm really excited about it.
Well, this is very interesting because we actually have a tradition in medicine to doing just that, not with AI, but with what we call clinical judgment and acumen. we incorporate how the patients feel and how they speak, their affect. I've picked up brain metastasis a number of times by just talking to patients on the phone and felt that something was off. Their affect was flat and they weren't the same. It's hard to quantify that, but it's something that is part of the fabric of how we practice medicine. So it seems like AI can help us quantify that and make it more objective, because currently it's all based on experience and intuition. A good example of some of these skills that unfortunately are being eroded, which may be fine if we have machines that we can rely on, is, for example, heart murmurs. I don't think the new generation of physicians graduating from med school are as good as the previous generation in detecting heart murmurs, because we do echocardiograms. Perhaps with AI, the way we do physical examination might change. Cora, what do you think about it?
I absolutely agree with you. I'm thinking about the Valsalva maneuver that I do on all my patients. What sets me is I saw a patient the other day, professor of medicine, a doctor, and I examined this patient for the first time. And he said, "You're the first doctor to actually examine me." I think that many of the young doctors and other doctors are not even examining patients anymore. I think they're seeing them on Zoom and they're seeing them from far away. And I think things are changing in a way that may not be the best way. I think we need AI to help us, but I think at the moment, we still need our own clinical judgment. I was a psychiatrist for 1 year only. I can tell when a patient's depressed when they're across the hallway before they walk into me. I can see it. And I think that kind of clinical judgment, AI does not. They don't have any clinical judgment. And we really need to just talk also about the ethics of using AI and the judgment of AI and many, many things that we can talk about for another hour, I think. But I think there are many things that AI can help us with. We need to develop it better.
Well, this was a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.